The carriage pulled away from Buckingham Palace on July 29th. Inside sat newlyweds Charles and Diana, waving to cheering crowds lining the streets. The world had just witnessed the fairy tale wedding of the century. What no one knew was that the nightmare had already begun. Now you will hear the part of the story no one ever truly understood. The wedding had been perfect in every visible way. 750 million people worldwide watched Diana walk down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in her ivory silk taffeta gown, with its 25-foot train. She was 20 years old, beautiful, nervous, and utterly unprepared for what marriage to the heir to the British throne would actually mean. Charles, 32, stood at the altar looking every inch the prince and feeling trapped in a role he'd never wanted to play. During the ceremony, Diana made a small mistake, reversing Charles's names in her vows. The world found it endearing, charmingly human. Charles heard it as confirmation that this young, inexperienced girl wasn't ready for the responsibilities ahead. It was a tiny moment, but it captured everything. The world saw romance, while Charles saw inadequacy. The reception at Buckingham Palace was elaborate and formal, filled with European royalty, dignitaries, and aristocrats. Diana barely knew. She smiled through hours of receiving lines, champagne toasts, and carefully choreographed photographs. Charles fulfilled his duties with practiced ease, but there was a distance in his eyes that Diana was only beginning to recognize. This wasn't the attentive courtship of the previous months. This was business. Then came the moment everyone anticipated, the honeymoon. The royal couple would spend 2 weeks aboard the royal yacht, Britannia, cruising the Mediterranean, followed by time at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. It sounded idyllic. It would be anything but no one knew the real consequence of that moment, or what Diana would discover in the first hours of her marriage. The wedding night itself was spent at Broadlands, the Hampshire estate that had belonged to Charles's beloved mentor, Lord Mountbatten. It was the same place where Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip had spent their wedding night in. The symbolism was intentional, continuing royal tradition, honoring family history. For Diana, exhausted from the day's events and overwhelmed by the sudden reality of her situation, it was just another reminder that nothing about this marriage belonged to her alone. Charles was polite but distant. That first night, there was no passionate romance, no intimate connection between newlyweds, finally alone together. Instead, there was awkwardness and duty. Diana, a virgin who had been raised with traditional expectations about wedding nights and romantic love, found the experience disappointing and confusing. Charles, already emotionally attached to Camilla Parker Bowles and going through the motions of a marriage he'd been pressured into, was present physically, but absent in every way that mattered. Diana cried herself to sleep on her wedding night. It was a pattern that would repeat for years to come. The next morning, they departed for Gibraltar to board the Britannia for their Mediterranean cruise. The yacht was luxurious, a floating palace with a full crew, private suites, and every amenity, but luxury couldn't create the intimacy that was missing. Charles brought stacks of books, his watercolors, and his own routines that had no space for a new wife. Diana, desperate for connection and reassurance, found herself increasingly alone, even in his presence. Imagine the confusion pressing down on Diana during those first days. She had married a prince, become a princess, fulfilled every childhood fantasy, and felt more isolated than ever in her life. The crew was deferential but distant. There were no friends, no family, no one she could talk to honestly about what she was feeling. Just endless, formal dinners, structured activities, and a husband who seemed happier reading in his cabin than spending time with her. Then came the discovery that would poison everything: photographs of Camilla. Diana found them while unpacking Charles's belongings. Multiple photographs of Camilla Parker Bowles, the married woman Charles had been involved with before his engagement to Diana. Some were recent. Charles had brought pictures of another woman on his honeymoon. When Diana confronted him about it, Charles was defensive and dismissive. Camilla was an old friend, he said. The photographs meant nothing, he claimed. Diana was being unreasonable and emotional. But Diana's instincts were correct. Charles hadn't stopped thinking about Camilla. He'd been pressured by his family and the palace to marry someone suitable. Young, aristocratic, virginal, acceptable to the public and the Church of England. Diana fit the requirements perfectly. That she was also vulnerable, eager to please, and desperately in love with the idea of being loved back made her easy to manipulate into a marriage that served the institution's needs rather than genuine partnership. What happened next would set the pattern for the entire marriage: Diana's emotional needs versus Charles's emotional unavailability. A few days into the honeymoon, something even more devastating occurred. Charles wore cufflinks that Diana recognized, gold with interlocking C's. She asked about them casually. Charles explained they were a gift from Camilla. He was wearing jewelry from his mistress on his honeymoon with his new wife. When Diana became upset, Charles seemed genuinely confused about why this bothered her. In his world, maintaining friendships from before the marriage was not only acceptable, but expected. That this particular friendship had been sexual and was undermining his marriage didn't seem to register. The cufflinks incident broke something in Diana. She realized with crushing clarity that Charles wasn't going to suddenly fall in love with her now that they were married. The wedding hadn't changed his feelings. The vows hadn't created commitment. She was legally and permanently bound to a man who was in love with someone else and saw no reason to hide it. Diana's eating disorder began during the honeymoon. She had struggled with bulimia before the wedding, triggered by the pressure of constant scrutiny and the stress of joining the royal family. But on the Britannia, it intensified. When she couldn't control her husband's feelings or her situation, she controlled her food. The binging and purging gave her a sense of agency in a life where she had almost none. The crew noticed her barely touching meals. Charles noticed but said nothing, perhaps relieved that dealing with her obvious distress wasn't required of him. The Mediterranean cruise included stops in Tunisia, Sicily, and Greece, exotic locations that should have been romantic. Instead, they were opportunities for carefully staged photo opportunities. Diana and Charles would pose together on deck, smiling for the cameras positioned on accompanying boats. The moment the cameras left, they retreated to separate spaces. The performance of happiness was exhausting. The reality of unhappiness was relentless. By the time they arrived at Balmoral for the second part of their honeymoon, Diana was already deeply depressed. Balmoral was the Queen's beloved Scottish estate, remote, traditional, governed by rigid royal routines that had been established for generations. Diana hated it immediately. The isolation, the formality, the endless hunting and outdoor activities she had no interest in, and the constant presence of royal family members who made clear she was expected to adapt to their ways, not the other way around. Charles, however, loved Balmoral. It was his refuge, his escape from public duties. He spent his days fishing, shooting, painting, and reading, all solitary activities that didn't require interaction with his new wife. Diana was left to navigate the complex hierarchy of royal life with no preparation, no support, and no sympathy. When she struggled, it was seen as her failure to adapt, not the family's failure to help her. And what happened next would show Diana just how alone she truly was. One evening at Balmoral, Diana attempted to explain to Charles how isolated and unhappy she felt. She tried to tell him about the bulimia, about crying constantly, about feeling like she was drowning. Charles's response was to tell her she was being overly emotional and that she needed to get a grip. When she persisted, he simply left the room. This pattern, Diana seeking emotional connection, Charles withdrawing from any vulnerability, would define their entire marriage. The Queen, who was present at Balmoral during much of this period, noticed Diana's unhappiness, but interpreted it as adjustment difficulties. Elizabeth had her own difficult early years in royal life and had survived by suppressing emotion and embracing duty. She expected Diana to do the same. The concept that someone might need emotional support, therapy, or even just honest conversation about their struggles was foreign to the royal worldview. You endured. You didn't complain. Prince Philip, Charles's father, was even less sympathetic. He found Diana's emotionality irritating, and her inability to simply conform frustrating. The palace operated like a military institution in many ways. You followed orders, met expectations, and personal feelings were irrelevant. Diana's repeated emotional crises were seen as weakness and attention-seeking rather than genuine mental health struggles. By the end of the honeymoon period, barely 6 weeks after the fairy tale wedding, Diana had learned several devastating truths. She had married a man who loved someone else. She had joined a family that valued institutional stability over individual well-being. She had no real support system, no escape route, and no way to express her suffering without being labeled as difficult or unstable. And she was likely already pregnant with William, which meant she was permanently trapped in this nightmare. The honeymoon marked the end of Diana's illusions about royal life and the beginning of her understanding of just how impossible her situation was. She had believed, naively, that love could develop after marriage, that Charles would grow to care for her, that becoming a princess meant being cherished and protected. Instead, she discovered she had been selected for breeding purposes, expected to produce heirs while quietly tolerating her husband's ongoing relationship with his mistress. What made it worse was that she couldn't tell anyone. The royal family operated under strict rules about never complaining publicly, never contradicting the official narrative, never admitting that anything was less than perfect. Diana was expected to smile for cameras, perform her duties, and suffer in silence. When she tried to reach out to her own family, they told her she'd made her choice and needed to make it work. When she tried to seek help from palace staff, they reported everything back to senior royals. She was completely, utterly alone. The cracks in Diana's mental state became more visible in the months following the honeymoon. She threw herself down the stairs at Sandringham while pregnant with William, a desperate cry for help that was dismissed as attention-seeking. She cut herself with a lemon slicer, with a penknife, leaving marks that couldn't be hidden. Charles's response was to become more distant, more frustrated with what he saw as irrational behavior. The more Diana needed emotional support, the less Charles was willing to provide it. The palace's response was to manage the optics rather than address Diana's suffering. She was assigned handlers who monitored her more closely, restricted her movements, controlled her access to outside communication. The prison became tighter, even as the public facade became more important. By the time William was born in June 1982, less than a year after the wedding, Diana had already attempted suicide multiple times. No one outside the palace walls knew. The fairy tale the world had celebrated was actually a horror story. The blushing bride in the enormous dress had been a sacrifice to institutional needs, not a cherished partner. The handsome prince was an emotionally stunted man acting out duty rather than desire. The wedding that looked like the beginning of a love story was actually the beginning of a slow-motion tragedy that would take 16 years to fully unfold. Diana's wedding night, that moment that should have been the culmination of romance and the beginning of partnership, was instead the moment she realized she had made a terrible mistake. But by then, she was trapped. Divorce was unthinkable. Leaving was impossible. Speaking truthfully was forbidden. She had no choice but to continue forward in a marriage that was destroying her, producing the required heirs, performing happiness for public consumption while dying inside. The photographs from the honeymoon show Diana in expensive clothes, visiting exotic locations, standing beside her prince. Look closely at her eyes in those images. The light that shone on the wedding day is already dimming. The smile is becoming fixed, performed rather than genuine. She's learning to hide, to protect herself, to survive rather than live. It's visible if you know what to look for. The moment when reality killed the fairy tale. Charles, in those same photographs, looks comfortable. He's in his element on the yacht at Balmoral, maintaining his routines. Diana's suffering doesn't register as his responsibility. He provided the wedding, the title, the security that she wanted. Love, partnership, emotional intimacy seemed to him like unreasonable demands. He'd done his duty. Why wasn't that enough? The honeymoon ended and real royal life began. The endless cycle of public duties, private misery, performed happiness, and hidden desperation. Diana learned to play the role of Princess of Wales, while the person inside that role slowly fragmented. Charles learned to avoid his wife's emotional needs by staying busy, staying distant, and staying connected to Camilla through secret phone calls and carefully arranged meetings. The world continued to believe in the fairy tale for years. The birth of William seemed to suggest happiness. The birth of Harry in 1984 reinforced the image of a successful royal couple. But behind closed doors, the marriage was already over. It had ended, really, before it fully began. Somewhere between the wedding ceremony and the wedding night, when Diana realized that being chosen wasn't the same as being loved. Some women can point to their wedding night as the beginning of their marriage. Diana could point to hers as the beginning of her disillusionment. The night that should have been about intimacy and joy was about distance and duty. The honeymoon that should have created a bond instead revealed how little bond existed. And the early months that should have been about falling deeper in love were actually about realizing that love had never been part of the equation. The wedding night truth was this: Diana married a man who didn't want to be married to her. She joined a family that saw her as a functional necessity, not a valued member, and she discovered, too late to escape, that the price of the crown was her happiness, her mental health, and eventually her life. The fairy tale was a lie. It always had been. She just didn't know it yet on July 29, 1981, when she said "I do" to a future she couldn't imagine and couldn't survive.